This is going to be an interesting one. So this came out of nowhere. There's an article by a trained historian called Brett Devereaux. I think that's how you say it. I think it's French. And he has written a 21-minute read time article on Warhammer 3 as a historian, which is interesting. And I can already imagine Warhammer fanboys saying, oh, this is a fantasy game. This is not about history. Historians have no authority to dismiss fantasy. But remember, this is all inspired. It's all used. Nihil novi subsole. There's nothing new under the sun. You take a map of medieval Europe, Holy Roman Empire, medieval France, England, all this shit, all these places, and then you just change a little bit, and also steal from Tolkien, Moorcock, Howard, maybe some more 20th century sci-fi fantasy writers, and then you just cobble all together in ways that you think sound cool at the time, and then this is what you get, Warhammer. So it's all inspired by historical shit. All the weapon archetypes, all the units, I'm sure you have equivalents of hussars and all that there. This goes into it quite a lot. Like Kislev, this is meant to be, well, we'll get into it, Muscovy, Russia. So it's all inspired, and I think it's interesting that when Total War started out in 2000, you had Sun Tzu being used to inform the way the combat works. The original military strategist of history that's written about strategy and tactics, mostly strategy, I think. And then you have, I think it was Stephen Turnbull, who was an expert in medieval Japanese history, and he was consulted as well to make it a more authentic, immersive gameplay experience. So you have these two aspects coming together. And that was Total War in 2000 at the very start, when it had a small team of developers, maybe like 10 or 20 people. So it was still worth it to consult back then, but now I don't think they bother. I don't think they really do consulting. They will obviously consult the people that tell them how this game is meant to work for Warhammer, but did they consult for Thrones of Britannia? Did they consult for Troy? I don't think they would need to. I don't think there's any evidence for it. I didn't get the feeling. Even Rome 2, what would you consult for? It's not like they're trying to achieve anything really there in terms of how it plays. It's just a mess. The games are just too bad and too much of a mess to really benefit from consultation with experts in history and weapons. Like, they would do stuff after the game launched for promotional marketing materials, where they would have people that would appear on the History Channel to talk about weapons of history and explain things. But do they actually use these people to design the games and the gameplay? I think it's probably less true than ever that they have. Anyway, I'm going to go through this article and see what we can observe, because I think this is interesting. You might see an increase in this kind of thing, because there's definitely an appetite there. Total War fans will sit and read and watch absolutely anything. They have such an appetite for this stuff that they'll buy shit games and shit DLCs. You can upload videos where you just speculate about useless bollocks, and you'll get like 50,000 views sometimes just because people click on that fucking thumbnail. So if there's a historian out there that is a gamer, this is all untapped. Like, you can probably sit writing about this stuff endlessly, and I think this guy does. I think he comments on Paradox games like Civ, so might see more of this from him and others. And it's really interesting to me to watch it, because obviously as Total War fans, we have some understanding of history, and we can learn from it and maybe even comment on it with our own insights. So he says, this week we're going to take a break from the more serious topics to look at infantry tactics and compositions in the Total War series, particularly in the light of the recent Total War Warhammer 3, a real-time strategy game. Nope. Close, but it's not an RTS. Of course, I've got videos going over that. RTS games set in late medieval, early modern high fantasy setting, the Warhammer setting, and how well or poorly some of those tactics correspond to their actual real-world historical counterparts. Oh yeah, this is promising. In particular, I want to look at how Creative Assembly, the studio behind this series of games, is attempting to create infantry units that occupy a flexible space between ranged and melee combat in an effort to shake up a Total War formula that is increasingly is beginning to feel a touch stale. Well, it has done for a decade now. Empire was arguably when they were the most ambitious. Shogun 2 trimmed a lot of stuff off of Empire, and then after Fall of the Samurai, they just gave up completely on any kind of real innovation where it matters. But in the process, as we'll see, Creative Assembly has essentially given up on modelling how firearm infantry in particular worked on most early modern battlefields. And when I saw this, a historian saying this, I said this back in, when was it? September, October 2020, and I had so much bullshit thrown at me, so much nonsense. The fucking apologetics were embarrassing. I had kids trying to actually argue against this nonsense, and it was just embarrassing. So here you have it. And also I had a petition as well. Let's get the petition. We want guns in Warhammer 3. So, even when I made this petition, I had people denying to my face that there were no guns in Warhammer, but you have it right here from a trained historian. Creative Assembly has essentially given up on modelling how firearm infantry in particular worked on most early modern battlefields. Absolutely damning. Fuck you. Middle finger up to all the people that were giving me shit about that. Don't you feel fucking stupid now? And moreover, has never actually attempted the most common historical solution to the need for an infantry unit that could engage in both fire, range combat, and shock, melee combat, what I'll call composite infantry units. Okay, so something I would comment on this just as someone that has played these games, not Warhammer though, because there's no point of spending money to play a clone of Three Kingdoms. Three Kingdoms had composite units. It had, what was it called? Something Dragons, Azure Dragons, wasn't it? Azure Dragons, and it was called Mixed Missile, just from memory. Mixed Missile. Alright, so here it is. It's got a different name here though on this article. It's called Mixed Spear. The unit splits into missiles at the back in rows with melee in front protecting them. So that existed. You had that at least. So what does he say here? Has never actually attempted the most common historical solution to the need for an infantry unit that could engage in both fire and shock melee combat, what I'll call composite infantry units. He might just not know about this. I don't think he's right about this. I think he has this wrong. Azure Dragons, this is one of the few things that I actually had positive to say about Three Kingdoms all along. The fact that they introduced two different behaviours simultaneously in a unit with mixed missile, and what would happen is that they would adopt a pose at the front of the unit like this. I'm gonna just get up. Man, believe it or not, I actually couldn't even find a single example on YouTube of someone using this formation. Easily accessible. I even searched videos where people had Azure Dragons in the title of the video and I couldn't find them using this formation. They would just be bad at the game and not even think to use it, even if it would work. So let's see how this goes. Mixed Spear. Well, we have Azure Dragons, Heavy Glaive and Bow Infantry. That's what it says. Heavy Glaive and Bow. So they do have the capability. And then when you click the button, man, this game runs like shit, but it might be because I'm mining. So you have the guys at the front that have glaives making a spear wall, and then you have the guys at the back that will have their bows ready, and they'll shoot. And it has all the problems that you would expect from bow units in this game, but it shows that there's at least... The fuck is that? What is that? What is that? What the fuck? Standard shot? Are they getting nerfed? The fuck is that? Why is there smoke appearing on them? What is that? Is that meant to stun them or something? Alright, let's try this now. Mixed missile here, let's see what happens. So they form up, they form into two separate groups. The guys at the back continue to fire. The one, oh yeah, and then they throw the caltrops, another stupid aspect of this game. Yeah, the shittiness is just, even after having not played this game for like 6 months, the shittiness just immediately becomes apparent. You have caltrops that get fucking lobbed as far as the arrows can be fired. Well, let's see how they do here. Guys getting pushed all the way back there, what the fuck, they're flying way back. Guys at the back keep shooting. Can I tell them to fire while they're engaged? Nah, of course not. The unit has to do this. And what are they shooting at? What? So they're in melee with this unit, and this unit, and they're firing at that unit. Yeah. So we can be engaged with one unit in a melee while we fire at another unit. And it's a first in Total War's history, I think, that you can do that, at the very least. And that's the demonstration. Mixed missile. Alright, back to what we're talking about. Just wanted to show that, because whenever I get a chance, I should launch the game and actually demonstrate it. Especially if I'm going to be contesting any of this. So he said here, Total War has never actually attempted the most common historical solution to the need for an infantry unit that could engage in both fire and shock. I think it has. I think I just showed that there, so I don't think that's quite right. I think he never played Warhammer 3 Kingdoms, or he just didn't know about that. Yeah. Alright, let's keep going. Kislev, what put me in mind of this topic was actually the unique faction quirk for the new human faction in Warhammer 3, Kislev. Kislev's unique tactical element is that most of their infantry units are hybrid units, capable of fighting effectively in both melee and at range. And as I just showed, that isn't original. It's not original. That was in 3 Kingdoms in 2019. This is unusual in Total War generally. Most units that have any kind of range attack are lightly armoured and poorly armed, and thus if forced into a close combat fight will handle it poorly. Yep, there's always been exceptions to that though. Like you had the, what were they, the Aventurier in Medieval 2. That was plated longbowmen fighting for the French. Maybe even Scots Guard would fit that description as well, something similar again. Scottish archers fighting for the French, good on a melee because they're Scottish, and also good at range because they might even have longbows, I'm not sure. But there have been units that have been strong in melee and at range. It's just that, of course, you generally want to specialise division of labour. You can only be good at one thing at one time. Usually if you're in a melee, you're not at range. You want men to specialise and be good at one thing, exemplary in that one thing, and then use them like that in conjunction with other men that are good at other things. It's just division of labour. Force multipliers, it's just how things work. It's rare that you would have the ability to be good at multiple things, competent. So whenever it happens, it might be interesting for gameplay, or it might not. I don't think it necessarily is good for the gameplay. It's a bit of a deviation from the whole rock, paper, scissors dynamic that you usually have that's the basis of a lot of the gameplay that you do when you're playing these games. So, jack of all trades as opposed to glass cannons, that kind of thing. Jack of all trades is kind of just boring. It's like having a character with 10 in every stat in an RPG. Boring, and you can't really do much compared to if you specialise, so that's why you don't usually see it. And if it's interesting, I think a lot of the interest in it will just be because it's unusual or novel. It won't be because it actually affords new gameplay possibilities. That inspiration here seems to be the historical streltsy, which were, prior to Peter the Great, the standard firearm infantry of Muscovy, Russia. You can tell this inspiration was on the minds of the developers because the streltsy are just straight up in the game as a unit called streltsy, and I'm going to use the spelling difference here to distinguish between them. Of course, the game streltsy must have a fantastical element, and in this case it's their melee weapon. The historical streltsy were primarily arquebusiers, that is, firearm troops who used a relatively short polearm, the bardiche, alongside their firearms. This isn't as radical as it sounds. Early muskets and arquebuses were long and very heavy, and so generally used with a fortrest, essentially a monopod that supported the end of the barrel. And that reminds me of the Jezzails that you would see as well. People see Jezzails, and it's their introduction to the word Jezzail, but I think Jezzails were actually used in the highlands of Afghanistan in guerrilla combat because they had superior range. So they would ambush columns or groups of infantry, outrange them, and essentially snipe them. An early sniper, and they would use these kinds of things to fire them like that, I think. And you see that to an extent in Warhammer 3 with the shields that they would try and use. That's something that was in Warhammer 2 as well. They're just reusing things there. I think in Warhammer 2 it was rats that had shield rests for long-barreled rifles, and then in Warhammer 3 I think the Chinese have it. So they're just recycling there. They just changed the aesthetic, but fundamentally it's the exact same unit with the exact same gameplay and the exact same decision making that happens every time. It's just recycling. A lot of recycling. So a lot of the time when something is alleged to be novel or new in Total War, it isn't new, it's happened before, sometimes even 15 years ago, and you see that quite a lot. The historical Streltsy combined that with their bardiche, which lacked a halberd spear point and so had a flat space to rest the arquebus. This of course forced significant compromises in the design of the bardiche, thus its short length. In game, the Streltsy take this up to 11 by combining their bardiche with their arquebus, replacing the rest of the firearm with an axe head. Looks cool, but is utterly impractical. Yep, that makes sense to me. Properties of a firearm don't necessarily synergise well with the role of a melee weapon. And I think he actually explains here that the bayonet was the solution to that, but Total War games have never really used bayonets. I think that was one of the main complaints about Fall of the Samurai. It doesn't have a bayonet. They didn't care enough to actually implement it. It wasn't important enough to do the work, I think, that would be required to implement that. Or they had their own reasons to not have bayonets. Empire had bayonets, I think. Does it say here? Don't think so. Creative Assembly took this hybrid concept and then applied it to Kislev's roster. Kossars, with a K, cringe, are archers who are also halfway decent melee. Armoured Kossars are frontline heavy infantry who also carry pistols, which they can volley. And the Ice Guards are high damage archers and high damage infantry, but fragile, so they're like glass cannons. And that's how archers are usually made good in melee. Even Cretan archers in Rome Total War had a decent melee stat, I remember. So you could use them to flank and charge into the back and get a somewhat respectable KD because they're being used defensively. And I think that's what archers would have. I think it was hatchets that they would have. Like the medieval English longbowmen would have axes, small axes. For most other factions, a switch-hitting melee range unit is typically an elite late-game unit. Yep, this is what I was describing with the Scots Guard, Aventurier, or Cretan Archers. They just seem to be good in general, so that's why they're capable in melee. But chances are any given Kislev army is going to be mostly composed of such units, which as a faction is what makes them unique. So they're meant to just be rugged, snowfaring, able to improvise, survive in any situation, even to the extent that if they're archers they can survive in a melee. What I find interesting here is that this type of unit, hybrid infantry, specifically effective armoured hybrid heavy infantry, seems to be increasingly common in Total War games, especially Warhammer. This is interesting, in part because it provides interesting tactical options, but actual historical hybrid infantry of this sort is relatively rare. I should be clear here, we're dealing with infantry today. Mounted archers often carried contact weapons and shifted between them and bows. Yeah, and samurai as well. Samurai were primarily archers on horseback, but they had melee weapons. That was what the samurai used most of the time, wasn't it? Bows on horseback. Because they were mounted, they could afford it. They were upper class, so they could afford whatever arms they wanted and a horse and armour. So, horse archers. I thought he was going to take a different tangent here. I thought he was going to say hybrid infantry, armoured hybrid heavy infantry seems to be increasingly common, which makes the games worse, because it turns the units into all generic variants of one another. Genericizes, makes the rosters more homogeneous, makes the factions more alike, where they'll play the same towards the same meta. But he's a historian that's sticking to that aspect. That's what I would think, though. If you're going to increase the frequency of this kind of an archetype, it would surely be detrimental to the gameplay if you're leaning heavily into something like that. And infantry, as we know, plays terribly in these modern Total War games. So if you're going to just have really expensive archers all the time that don't die in a melee, it makes the game really samey. It forces the meta. I don't know what he means about interesting tactical options here. I think we would just have a different idea what that is. Because I don't think this makes it interesting. Like, I don't think they've succeeded at what they're trying to do. I don't think they could. I think it's not new, it's not interesting. Like, see if you were to actually go into these interesting tactical options, I don't think you'd be able to really say much about what he means there. I think this is all hypothetical and unrealised. Infantry that was expected in the normal course of battle to both fight at range and also in shock and melee, while not unheard of, was relatively rare. Yeah. Seems like a good way to get valuable assets lost or attritioned. The actual Streltsy at best skirt the definition themselves. Streltsy literally means shooter in Russian. Dedicated firearm troops. Unarmoured. In a period where shock cavalry and shock infantry still wore armour. And then he shows an example. So they have a short polearm and an arquebus. A soldier of the Streltsy. Note how he wears effectively no armour, being primarily a musketeer. Yeah, a musket, not an arquebus. 16th century to the early 18th century. So this is interesting, and he's comparing how the actual Streltsy fought to how the Streltsy fight in Warhammer. The Streltsy weaponised the arquebus rests, which is an interesting innovation, but doesn't actually give them radically different capabilities from a Western musketeer who carries a sword. So, what's he talking about here? Weaponised the arquebus rests. So how would they do that? The point. Yep, so he's going into how the history has a lot of complexity to it. You had weaponisation of arquebus rests as essentially a pike or even a bayonet. There's so much that you could do, and modern Total War games just don't do any of this, because he already said up here that they've essentially given up on modelling how guns work. Creative Assembly has essentially given up on modelling how firearm infantry in particular worked on most early modern battlefields. There's all this possibility, all this potential, and they choose to realise absolutely none of it. I don't know if this guy even realises. I was surprised by the wording that he uses here, because it seems to just echo exactly what I said in my video about the Flaccidification of Total War's ranged combat, which he might find interesting as a historian, because I've always been interested in reading what historians say about historical weapons. Like, he might like my video if he hasn't seen it, but I think he might have, and I think that might have informed this attitude that he has here, but I might be wrong. We might just have concordantly arrived at the exact same conclusion here. But yeah, we definitely are both saying the same thing here, that they've just not even tried to tap into the rich history that we have. Even the sound sucks. Yeah, and this is what I was going to say before I get sidetracked. I don't know if this guy even realises that the velocity of the projectiles of these guns in these games is barely above arrow, bolt, sling shot velocity, because they all are about 50 to 70 metres a second between all of them, whereas the guns in Warhammer are 100 metres a second, and they have terrible range, and they can shoot through each other. I can't remember if he actually goes into that. Composite Infantry. Composite Infantry, alright, so he says here, I should be clear, I'm making this term up to make a contrast between what Total War has. and what it doesn't have. Units composed of 2 or more different kinds of infantry working in concert as part of a single unit, which I'm going to call composite infantry. Yeah, so you have units that are capable of doing 2 things, but he actually says here, different kinds of infantry working in concert, and that wouldn't be what Azure Dragons are. In that case, Azure Dragons are, every man is capable of doing both roles, and the unit splits into 2 pretty randomly, and then they start performing separate roles at the same time. It's an old concept. Neo-Assyrian Empire did that. Archer and spear and shield. Spearmen or shield bearers. Tactical value of this kind of composite formation is obvious. Yep, archers can develop fire, while the spearmen provide move and cover and protection against sudden enemy attack by chariot or cavalry with their spears. Even Medieval 2 didn't utilise this kind of thing, because you had pavis that you could have used. They could have planted their pavis. It just stays on their backs. Oh wait, it actually says here, the result was self-shielding, shot-capable foot archer formations. Total War Warhammer also flirts with this idea with foot archers who have their own shields, but often simply adopt the nonsense solution of having those archers carry the shields on their backs and still gain the benefit of their protection when firing, which is not how shields work. Yeah, exactly. Medieval pavis. We see a more complex version of this kind of composite infantry organisation in the armies of the Warring States and China, Han Dynasty. Chinese infantry in this period used a mix of weapons, swords, crossbows and a polearm. The G, which had both long spear point but also a hook and striking blade. In Total War 3 Kingdoms, which represents the late Han military, these troops types are represented in distinct units. You have a regiment of G polearm armed troops, a regiment of sword and shield troops, or a regiment of crossbowmen, which maneuver separately. So you can have a block of polearms or a block of crossbowmen, but you cannot have a mixed formation of both. I'm not sure if he knows about the mixed missile formation that allows you to have 2 things happening at the same time in one unit, because that seems to contradict this a bit. I don't know if he knows. Except there's a significant amount of evidence suggesting that this is exactly how the armies of the Han Dynasty used these troops. What seems to have been common is that infantry were organised into 5-man squads with different weapon types, which would shift their position based on the enemy's proximity. So against a cavalry or chariot charge, the G might take the front rank with heavier crossbows in support, while the stormed armed infantry moved to the back, getting them out of the way of the crossbows while still providing mass to the formation. I think he doesn't know, but I think he's mostly right anyway, because it's like an exception. There's only really one unit that can do that, and it doesn't really work in the way that you would want. You have to activate it, and then they separate like that, and it's really clunky, as you saw, so it doesn't even really work properly. It's like he is addressing a problem that CA themselves have acknowledged to an extent with introducing mixed missile formation. Pike and shot. This is a particularly acute problem for direct fire missile infantry, which in Total War games generally means firearm infantry, whereas Total War allows bows and crossbows to fire at high arcs with high effectiveness, which they generally shouldn't. Firearms in exchange for their higher damage have to fire on flat trajectories and thus need uninterrupted lines of sight, meaning they cannot simply be tucked into the back rank to fire over the front ranks. Instead, most players use some sort of a checkerboard formation to combine contact and direct fire missile infantry, and often archers too. Yet this is really weird. You see people bring in armies of 20 units of guns or archers, and then they just make spaced lines that are offset to simulate this, a checkerboard, and they just sit and watch their units use up all their ammo, and it's a really boring, unstimulating way to play the game that's effective, because if your archers can fire all their ammo, or almost all their ammo, then they do all of their damage, and maybe even do it before the enemy can even get in a melee, or if they get in a melee, they only deplete the front line a little bit when they blob around it. And he addresses that here, I think. Getting enemy units hung up on the front line so that ranged units can fire at them through the gaps. Taking advantage of the fact that individuals in a total war formation cannot push too far from the rest of their unit, and so if just a few soldiers get caught on the edge of an infantry formation, it'll prevent the entire block from just pushing through the gap. Yep, so it's really gamey. A fairly standard checkerboard total war formation with Reichland. I play almost exclusively single player, but my understanding is that in a multiplayer setting you'd want the intervals between units to be wider than this. Yeah. Slow fire and arquebus infantry were exquisitely vulnerable on early modern battlefields, particularly to cavalry, which might cross the entire effective firing range of these weapons so fast the arquebuses might only have 1 or 2 shots. One solution we've already noted was to put them behind wagons and other movable barricades. The obstructions would prevent a cavalry charge on the firearms. For a more mobile option, we can look at the tactical system that emerged in Western and Central Europe during the early modern period, pike and shot. Pike and shot formations often employed a range of soldiers, including swordsmen and halberdiers, but the bulk of these units was made of soldiers with pikes, typically armoured with at least a helmet and a cuirass, and soldiers armed with firearms, muskets or arquebuses, typically unarmoured with a sword as a backup weapon, that is, the shot. The concept was deceptively simple. A large square of pikemen created a safe base for the shot to fire from. Early on, the shot mostly existed to support and screen the pike, with the expectation that the pikes would be the decisive offensive weapon seen off enemy pikemen and what was termed the push of pike. Yep, as firearms got better and more importantly firearm drill got better, the pike increasingly became the supporting arm to the shot. The ratios of pike to shot in these units changed accordingly, initially favouring more pikes, later more shot. Yeah, I know all about that, I've read about that a lot. The push of pike, the bad war. And so far this doesn't sound entirely different from Total War checkerboarding, but as always the devil is in the details. Actual cavalry, after all, could have rushed through the gaps of any sort of checkerboard, unlike the cavalry formations of Total War, which get stuck as described above. Indeed, this is why the pike fought in squares. Oh wait, he has a little notation there. The sticking behaviour in turn is pretty clearly a necessary response to the inability to make composite infantry formations work in Total War. Without it, it would be easy to push cavalry through around blocking infantry to get to enemy ranged units, and indeed this was obnoxiously easy in some Total War games and is still a problem with monstrous infantry in Total War Warhammer. Yep, pull through. It's actually considered to be an exploit. If you pull a unit cavalry through a gap, just pull it right through. People bitch about it, people complain. This is why pike fought in squares. It was assumed the cavalry was mobile enough to strike a group of pikemen from any direction and to whirl around in the empty spaces between pike formations, so a given pike square had to be able to face its weapons out in any direction, or indeed all directions at once. Yep, like the Sheltrum as well. So it's like a hollow square. Instead, pike and shot were combined into a single unit. The standard form of this was the tercio, the Spanish organisational form of pike and shot, and one which was imitated by many others. In the early 16th century, the standard organisation of a tercio, at least notionally, as these units were almost never at full strength, was 2,400 pikemen and 600 arquebusiers. In battle, the tercio itself was a manoeuvre unit, moving as a single formation, albeit with change in shape. They were often deployed in threes, thus the name tercio meaning a third, with 2 positioned forward and a third behind in between, allowing them to support each other, like a triangle. The normal arrangement for a tercio was a bastion square with a sleeve of shot. The pikes formed a square at the centre, which was surrounded by a thin sleeve of muskets. Then at each corner of the sleeve there was an additional smaller square of shot. Placing those secondary squares, the bastions, named after the fortification element, on the corner allowed each one a wide potential range of fire, and would mean that any enemy approaching the square would be under fire at minimum from one side of the sleeve and 2 of the bastions. Yep, so less dead zones, more fire being brought to bear, if it can be drilled, and that's what he goes on to say. That said, if drilled properly, the formation could respond dynamically to changing conditions. Shot might be thrown forward to provide volley fire if there was no imminent threat of an enemy advance, or it might be moved back to the shelter behind the square if there was. If cavalry approached, the square might be hollowed and the shot brought inside to protect it from being overrun by cavalry. Yep, so it's adaptable and flexible. And Total War management of tactical units, the units themselves, is really clunky and inflexible, and you don't have much control or freedom. This is part of why people get so excited at Manor Lords. They see all of these behaviours like forward face and retreat and being able to adjust formations, and they get really excited at all the possibility and potential that it has. Total War has not experimented or really tapped into any of this potential. It's extremely stagnant. It's stuck so hard. It's regressing, in fact. This guy describes Total War as being stagnant, but I would say it's actually extremely regressed. It's behind where it was with the first game in 2000. Medieval, like, see all the Total War games, I can think of ways that modern ones are just way behind. With Shogun 1, all the tactics of terrain and stamina and fatigue is gone. With Medieval 1, weather, just immediately. Weather no longer stops arquebus from being able to shoot, or makes bows less potent, and also stretching out lines of archers into long, thin, 1 or 2 man thick lines has no benefit compared to when it did back in Medieval 1. Compared to Rome Total War, height advantage is gone as well. Compared to Medieval 2, the depiction of firearms is absolute dog shit compared to how good it was in Medieval 2. See how I can just do this over and over again for every game? There's just so many ways that it's regressed. So to say Total War is stagnant, I think is a bit of an understatement. I think you should actually say it's completely regressed massively. In the 1600s, against other pike and shot formations, it became more common to arrange the formation linearly, with the pike square in the centre with a thin sleeve of shot, while most of the shot was deployed in 2 large blocks to its left and right, firing in countermarch. This is something else. So Shogun 1 had countermarch drills, see? Another thing that's just not been in Total War for ages, the fucking countermarch. This was in my Flaccidification video too. I went through all of this, all of these gutted, stripped features. Each man firing and moving to the rear to reload in order to bring the full potential firepower of the formation to bear, which the unit does on its own through its innate programmed behaviours in Shogun 1. That was where it was best. And then in Medieval 2 you had to toggle it with skirmish being on and off to alternate that behaviour. And then in Warhammer, there's no need for this because the whole unit can fire through itself. This guy talked about Total War's giving up. Total War has essentially given up on modelling how firearm infantry worked, and there's so many opportunities to explain that because Total War had a lot of these things this guy's talking about. Total War used to try to implement a lot of aspects that he's addressing as a historian, encompassing, describing, but just doesn't want to anymore. It's not worth doing, they don't care at all. So, yeah, I'm glad I can add this stuff onto this article, add this commentary onto it. I think it's important. Indeed, it's worth expanding on that point, volley fire. Empire had that, yep. Empire had all these drills. The great limitation for fire... Empire was 2009, and it had volley fire, it had all these different ways that the units would fire. The great limitation for firearms, and to a lesser extent crossbows, was the combination of frontage and reloading time. And this is great for gameplay. There's so much thought that you can put into how you play because of these two aspects when they're modelled properly. And Total War doesn't model it anymore. The limited frontage of a unit restricted how many men could shoot at once, but too wide a unit was vulnerable and hard to control, and long reload times meant long gaps between shots. The solution was synchronised volley fire, allowing part of a unit to be reloading while another part fired. In China, this seems to have been used with crossbows, first used with crossbows, but in Europe, it really only catches on with muskets. Didn't they do that in Japan with... Wasn't the first volley fire done in Japan? Am I right or am I wrong? Wasn't that the first time organised salvos were done? Was it Nagashino where that happened? One of the earliest at the very least. So the Japanese had guns relatively late because they came from Europeans. The Tanegashima. And they quickly developed their own firearm tactics within only a few years or decades, and were deploying volley fire successfully in crucial battles that were pivotal for the history of Japan. Feudal Japan. What's it called again? Sengoku Jidai period. We see early experiments with volley fire in the late 1500s, with a version that catches on being proposed by William Louis of Nassau-Dillenburg to Maurice of Nassau in 1584. The countermarch, as it came to be known, ends up associated with Maurice. Initially, the formation was 6 ranks deep, but as reloading speed and drill improved, it could be made thinner without a break in fire, and eventually leading to 18th century fire-by-rank drills with 3 ranks, like you have in Medieval 2, and it works really well. Though by this time, these were opposed by drills where there were first 3 ranks, the front kneeling, the back slightly offset, would all fire at once, but with different sections of the line firing at different times, fire by platoon, like an Empire. And this is what you would want. You would either have 2 ranks firing simultaneously, like in Shogun 1 with Neil fire, and Shogun 2 with Neil fire, or you would have fire by rank with 3 ranks, and it would countermarch. That's what you would do, and I think that's exactly how Shogun 1 worked. its first try encompassed all of this. It was addressed in a dignifying, satisfying way. Coming back to Total War, the irony is that while the basic components of Pike and Shot warfare exist in both Empire and for the Empire faction and Warhammer, in both games it isn't really possible to actually do Pike and Shot warfare. Even if an army combines Pike and muskets, the unit sizes make the kind of fine manoeuvres required of a Pike and Shot formation impossible. Yeah, because it's just so clunky. They haven't really developed any of this shit. It was really primitive back in 2000 with Shogun 1, and we fundamentally still just got the exact same shit. And while it is possible to have missile units automatically retreat from contact, it's not possible to have them pointedly retreat into a Pike unit. Yep, imagine if you could designate a unit of guns with a composite partner, and then whenever they are on skirmish mode, they will run towards and through that paired unit. There's so much that you could do. There's so much. They could model it however they wanted. All they'd have to do is be creative. Maybe they are just composite in their nature when they are on the battlefield. They're already paired. Maybe you could actually buy units that have the ability to fight in this kind of way, where men behave differently depending on what the role is in the unit, and it changes spontaneously. You could do a lot of stuff. There's so much potential, and we haven't really seen any of it tried as players. Indeed, if anything, the Total War series has been moving away from the gameplay elements which would be necessary to represent this kind of synchronized discipline and careful formation fighting possible. While earlier Total War games experimented with synchronized discipline in the form of volley fire drills, for example fire by rank, that feature was essentially abandoned after, guess what, Shogun 2's Fall of the Samurai DLC. So that's the last time we see this stuff done, then it gets abandoned. Abandoned is the word. Instead of fire by rank, musket units in Total War Warhammer are just permitted to fire through other members of their unit. Yeah, this is where I thought that he saw my video, because this is not an observation that I really saw be made by anyone. I had to determine this myself by just sitting down and thinking, alright, what the fuck is wrong with these games? Why is the gameplay in these games so shit? Why does this look all wrong? Why does this feel so bad? And then I just arrived at all of these different conclusions and put it into a video. And then he's saying it here. So he's on the ball regardless. I just wonder to what extent it's because of the past couple of years of shit show that has been stirred up around this that I've tried to do my best to contribute towards. Musket units fire through other members of their unit to allow all the soldiers in the formation, regardless of depth or width, to fire. They cannot fire through other friendly units, however. Yep, see, this is the exact way I phrased it as well. They can fire through their own unit, but they can't fire through other units of their own. That's actually a striking and frustrating simplification. Volley fire drills, and indeed everything about subsequent linear firearm warfare, was focused on efficient ways to allow more men to be actively firing at once. That complexity is simply abandoned in the current generation Total War games. Yep, so that's a historian who has a background in this kind of stuff telling you what I said already in almost exactly the same terms. Fuck you, Warhammer fanboys, you fucking absolute shit-eating, credulous, gullible fucks. Reducing complexity. Now, for fans of the Total War series, it is in some ways not difficult to see why the abandoned complexity of composite infantry and synchronized musketry have been abandoned, or were never attempted at all. The complex internal movements and manoeuvres are finicky and break easily. That problem was compounded by the shift from sprites to 3D models. If a pixelated low-res sprite needs to skip part of its reload animation, or slide awkwardly into position, most players won't notice. But if a fully modelled 3D soldier does so, it would look absurd. But then without that ability to fudge, and without the flexibility of a unit composed of actual humans, getting the complex drill to go off properly ends up being difficult. Well, it's not like they really mind about all this kind of jank and silly shit. You have guys that get hit with an arrow and fly like fucking 10 feet. You have these things that climb up ladders, pink horrors climbing up ladders. You have extremely janky flying. You have giant things pushing each other around the battlefield like they're on ice in Warhammer. It's not as if they really are concerned about this kind of thing, because the games already look absurd and they don't care. They look absolutely terrible now. Troy looks ridiculous with Achilles, who sticks his knee up and then 3 guys fly, or who gets surrounded by like fucking 200 guys and stays alive for 20 minutes. Players who played Empire will know this difficulty well. Fire by rank drill ends up being an extremely powerful ability, but getting it to go off right requires a lot of babysitting. Units have to face just right, be positioned just right, and so on. There's nothing so frustrating as watching a 100 plus unit of muskets fail to execute its fire by rank attack because a handful of fellows in the corner were reloading at the wrong time, and for some reason this meant that the whole unit had to stop and wait for them. Meanwhile, fire by platoon exists in Empire Total War but is entirely broken, actually being less effective than fire by rank because the game can't handle reloading by platoons, with the result that each platoon fires one after the other, but everyone waits to start reloading until after the last platoon has fired. This is interesting. I never checked this and saw it myself, so that's interesting. That just means that they haven't even finished modelling it properly. They didn't complete it. They would have had to have done additional work to make sure this happens. It already divides the unit up into groups. They just have to implement all the behaviours to make it work properly, but they couldn't do it. They gave up, shipped with shame, and then never patched. Fallen Samurai brings a new firing, but it's too finicky and liable not to work properly except under utterly perfect conditions. True to an extent, but you can really make it work so well. It really does work. But it does have a lot of janky bullshit. Finicky is the word. And it seems clear to me that at some point Creative Assembly simply looked at these complexities and decided they weren't worth it and abandoned them, much like they largely abandoned naval battles. Yep, so he's really hitting the nail on the head here. They abandoned naval battles and the more complex trade and economic models of their other games. Yep, this is why I don't give a shit about all these people that say they play for the campaign. The campaign in Total War games now is fucking garbage. You could do so much stuff with synergizing for resources and it would all feel really immersive and opportunistic. Like, see when you build up a trade empire around the Greek peninsula or around specific resources, it can feel really satisfying to see your revenue start to spike after you've worked on building up that aspect. But now, it's not there. You're just playing in Three Kingdoms, you're just matching up colours. It feels like something you would do in playgroup as a kid. All the purple blocks go together, all the yellow blocks go together. Like, fuck's sake, what is this? And he says here, and I think frankly that's a shame, it leaves a noticeable gap in terms of historical ways of fighting, because composite infantry executing synchronised fighting drills were both common, but also tended to be the best and most lethal sorts of infantry in their day. This was the fighting style of the trained elite professionals. Yep. So all of the things that they can use to their advantage are being used at the same time, and they have results from it. They have the ability to fight as tactical units and squads that work together. Advantages for specific circumstances at the most bottom tactical level of individual men. This utilises that, so it's not a surprise. I also think that as a challenge Creative Assembly ought to return to. It is by now a commonplace that the Total War franchise, I think he means it is by now a commonplace thought or sentiment or belief or expression. There's a word missing there, and I wish I knew what one it was. It's by now a commonplace saying that the Total War franchise has been stuck in something of a rut. Total War Rome 2 and its standalone expansion Attila both frustrated many fans. Also, Rome 2 is 2013, not 2012. Thrones of Britannia, Three Kingdoms and Troy all received criticism for having limited unit variety, and I like how he uses unit variety here instead of saying diversity. There we go. It just shows that this unit diversity phrase is a bullshit crutch for inarticulate people if they never see it being repeated by people that are actually educated. Armies that felt samey and for not innovating enough off of the basic formula that, in the purely historical games, Creative Assembly hasn't really nailed since Shogun 2 back in 2010. Look at that! Trained historian. Even the trained historians think that Shogun 2 was the last time CA did well. I said Total War's last success was 8 years ago in 2020, and I got constant shit for it. And that was the most softly spoken, benign video I've ever fucking made. I was really calm and non-confrontational with that video. I was just making the argument that I thought I had to make, and I got fucking harassed for it by these fanboy losers. And then you have a historian saying it, the exact same fucking thing, barely 2 years later. Amazing. A year and a half later. Total War Warhammer has avoided this fate in part because the fantasy setting lends itself to a lot of unit variety. but it isn't hard to see with factions like Kislev and Cathay that the developers are struggling to make factions that play sufficiently differently from one another to keep things interesting. So the Warhammer promise was an empty one, as I've always said as well. He agrees with me on that. They haven't even tried to utilise the possibility here, but then he does say they would argue they mostly succeed. Warhammer 3 would be an excellent addition to this franchise if it weren't for how much of a slog its primary campaign is. All eyes now turn to the final combined campaign, Immortal Empires, to arrive sometime in the future. One way then to break up the formula would be to begin experimenting again with trying to get those more complex systems to work. Yep, but they have no incentive to do that while people just want superficial spectacle that doesn't necessarily have anything interesting going on under the hood. It can be as superficial as possible and still work. That's what they are incentivized to go for. So it's not going to happen. It is really striking looking at their series that Empire Total War really was the peak of Creative Assembly's ambition. Yep. A global map, naval battles, complex truce simulation, multiple forms of government, elections, and yes, synchronized infantry drill, though not with composite units. Their games since then have steadily reduced the scope of features, pruning down to a core that works well. You can see that core in particular working well in Warhammer 3 Kingdoms, but lacks variety. Yep. Creative Assembly needs to take risks again. They really do now, after Warhammer 3's failed so hard. So this is my suggestion. Go back to Empire. I'd love to see the series put the resources into tackling the more complex combat of the 1500s to 1600s. Empire originally had a start date of 1700s, so this would be an expansion of scope, incorporating both composite infantry units, that is the Pike and shot system, that actually works as composite units with the ability to alter formations as necessary to respond to the changing conditions and use synchronized fire and drills. Because to innovate in a franchise like this, Creative Assembly doesn't need gamey historical gimmicks. Which is exactly what they've went for. The most gamey, phony, superficial, spectacle crap. Just gimmicks, all gimmicks. You saw that in Three Kingdoms with the Juggernaut. Like, my god, that seemed really desperate. It didn't even work properly. It was just there so that they could use it in marketing trailers. It was so obvious. It was like a half-finished unit. There's plenty enough complexity in actual historical warfare to allow the series to continue moving forward and staying fresh, and at the same time, Creative Assembly has the resources to actually tackle these more complex fighting systems at a higher degree of visual fidelity and detail than other valiant efforts to model the period. Pike and shot campaigns on Steam? What the fuck? 2015 Pike and shot campaigns. Interesting. Oh, sweet. Gustavus Adolphus. 30 Years' War. And that's it for this week, though I should note we'll be back to Total War not too far in the future to talk about how it misrepresents the command of pre- and early modern armies as a window into looking at how trying to wrangle an army like that one on the battlefield actually worked. That might be interesting. Yep, so this was a good article, I think. It went into a lot of the things that I would never usually touch, like with the Streltsy and all the historical inspiration, but he also talks a little bit, especially later on, about the gameplay, and then he really does sum up properly in a way that I would have as well. So it's like he baits in his usual audience of historians with all of the historical stuff, and then it really goes towards what the gamers would like to read about with the end of the article. And yeah, it's nice to be vindicated from every quarter. Interesting stuff, and I'm glad he wrote it and published it. To support my work, you can go to my Patreon page. Special thanks to Matteo Olivetti, Nerdington, The Roadie 451, and Halcyon.